a question that I'm interested in. I have many interests that are relevant to this network, but I decided to focus on this one today. We can talk about other interests I have. So I don't mean to imply by asking this that no one has yet got a robot to sing. Maybe they have, but I still think, considering the question, what would it be? What if there are singing robots now? Why are they singing robots? What is it that makes them singing? And I think I have interests in that question. Well, I have interest in that question both, from a philosophical perspective, but also a practical AI perspective, and as a cognitive scientist, trying to use the insights from the first two to maybe understand aspects of our own performance and other kinds of cognition. So I think in order to answer the question, what would it be for a robot to sing, it seems to me, at least I have to get clear on what is it to sing in a theoretical sense. Of course, we all have an idea in some more pragmatic sense of what it is to sing. But I don't think it's about reproducing the kinds of acoustic signals that humans produce. That's not sufficient for singing, and it's not even necessary, as consider the case of birdsong, if that's a case of singing, which I think it is. So I'll just jump to the working hypothesis now is that singing is a kind of embodied dynamic musical performance. And we can contrast it, and it's traditionally contrasted with instrumental musical performance. But I will instead be focusing on the similarities between instrumental musical performance and singing. So for one thing, maybe that contrast isn't really available for robots, given that they don't have a real body in the sense that we do. There can't be a contrast between making sounds with the body versus using some tool. Maybe they only have tools. I'm not exactly sure how this relates to the exosomatic organ concept, but I'm sure it does. And then I'm going to also ignore the constraint that singing is musical. I just can't address everything here. So I'm just going to focus on performance, embodied dynamic performance. So really, in a way, I'm just asking, what would it be for a robot to have a voice? But putting it that way would be misleading, because people think they already have an answer to that question because of the overemphasis on the linguistic case. And we're trying to get away from that particular emphasis, I think, in this network. So I think it's best to keep it back with singing. So by embodied dynamic musical performance, I mean to contrast, for example, actual robot singing with something like on stage sending a wave file to a digital to analog converter. That is the paradigmatic case of not a robot singing, according to the way I'm investigating this issue. I don't mean to criticize that. I'm sure it can have it could even play a valid role as singing in certain, especially artistic contexts, but that's just not the area, that's not the kind of singing I'm interested in. Why not? Well, I think essential to the notion of the kind of singing I'm interested in understanding is that the outcome should be uncertain. There isn't a tight link between the parameters of the sound generation and the outcome. So, in fact, the outcome may fail to conform to some kind of intended outcome. And that gap, I think, is characteristic of performance in general, what we call human performance. Not that there might be certain individuals at certain times for whom that gap shrinks to near zero or zero, but that's understood against a background of possibility of failing to meet an intended goal or divergence from an intention, which might not be considered a failure, but might be considered synergistic or fortunate. In particular, singing is non-ballistic. It's not like pressing a piano key. There's an ongoing modulation, an ongoing control of the activity, and that's related to it being a performance rather than just sending a wave file to DAC. And that kind of ongoing control requires responding to feedback. And in this case, and that's a kind of important dynamics of responding, the thing that's making an action or generating a sound, responding to, I'm not going to say the environment, because in this case I'm focusing on listening to oneself. So a key aspect of singing is hearing oneself and changing one's one's voice and one's output, if you want to call it that, as a result of that feedback. So it's listening, but the special case of listening to oneself. Because all music making, you could say, or generally speaking, involves, especially when you're performing with others, involves a kind of listening to make sure you're coming in at the right time, or that you're maintaining tempo, or your intonation is correct. But I mean this kind of listening to oneself as a way of generating the sound in a way that is also shared in certain kinds of instrumental performance, like playing a violin, constant listening, constant modulation of motor control in order to achieve a particular goal. So the two kinds of listening or feedback that one can use in order to do this kind of embodied dynamic performance. One is real-time feedback. You can listen to the output of your voice or whatever it is, however you're generating sound, and you can compare that, say, to some kind of intended, or you can evaluate it and say, do I like that? Do I not like that? Is that what I had in mind? Is it not what I had in mind? And you can adjust. And that's, in some sense, more ideal than, it's more pure than the other kind of listening I'm going to mention, but it's also too late. It's after the event. It's post. You've already made that sound. You're responding to it, but it's now too late to go back and unmake that sound, at least in any direct sense. But there's also virtual listening, and I'm using ideas that have also been applied in the case of motor control for, say, reaching behavior. We've found that the way that we get smooth reaching behavior is by getting feedback not from the world, because that would be too late, but we get feedback from emulator circuits, forward models that we have of how we expect the visual and proprioceptive signals to change as we engage in an activity. So we're simulating the world at a faster rate than the world. We're simulating ourselves at a faster rate than we're actually acting, and we use that simulated behavior in order to to tell us whether or not we are doing well. And so we use these internally generated pseudo-virtual feedback signals as a way to guide our performance. Now that does require real listening, not just this virtual listening, but the kind of listening in approach 1 in order to learn those models. But in the online moment of performance, yes, there might be this, but there's also this kind of virtually guided listening feedback that to add to your control of your performance. So here's an idea of how you can, say, give a robot this type of ability. You could have approach 1 would just be you have some kind of idea of what kind of sound you want to create, and you have some kind of system that can create sounds, and you create a sound and you compare the created sound to the intended sound, and any differences between them can go back and affect your future performance. But there's also this virtual listening approach where you have this forward model, this prediction of what will happen if you continue doing what you're doing, and you can compare that to what you would like to happen or your intended sonic performance, and that can constrain what it is the sounds you're going to make, and change parameters there even before you've got to that part of the actual performance. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about here, and that is essentially using listening. Listening is used in order to generate the model. Listening to oneself is used in order to generate the model, in addition to listening being used to provide after-the-fact feedback. Finally, my last slide is that I have interests beyond these kinds of this emphasis on synthesis and creation of sound. In general, I'm interested in machine models of consciousness or conscious experience, and a particular proposal that relates to this network is that I do think there is a role for content in explaining cognition and experience. So the content of experience is at least partly determined by the content of our expectations that are manifested in the kinds of forward models that I was describing before, in these emulator circuits and other kinds of forward models. And for those of you who know what predictive coding models are, it's similar to that, but distinct from that. and it predates them. But also, to talk about something that's actually been done rather than something that I'd like to do, some of my work is focused on how we can better understand the function of consciousness by understanding unconscious auditory and visual processing. So in collaboration with some psychologists here at Sussex, we found that cross-modal associations, that's say audio to visual associations, can be learned even when neither the audio stimulus nor the visual stimulus are consciously experienced. And that was a rather surprising novel result that hadn't been established before, that you can actually learn an association between a sound that you actually don't perceive. You don't hear. You ask the subject, did you hear anything? Did you hear any music? They say no. And you give them a visual pattern as well, and you ask them if they saw anything. They say no. But nevertheless, we can show that in their behavior later that they did associate that sound with that visual pattern. So it's a kind of unconscious listening that might be the kind of more analogous to what's going on with current kinds of machine listening, and the difference between actual conscious listening might, in the human case, might suggest directions we could take for algorithmic machine listening. Thank you for listening, and I just want to mention that this work is based on discussions I've had with Evelyn and Ed here in the music department, and I don't know why the screen keeps going. Okay, and also thanks to the rest of you out there I've talked to about this. Thank you.